Shalom. So welcome, everyone. I am Alicia Post. I am the Executive Director of the RZA. Thank you so much for joining us for this important and most timely conversation. The RZA, the Religious Zionists of America, Mizrachi, is a movement that strives to build a strong bridge between Israel and the American Jewish community, support the state of Israel, and ensure that American Jews are connected to and taking responsibility for the state of Israel and the future of the Jewish people. As you may have noticed, you are all muted, but I do encourage you to ask questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as time permits towards the end of the presentation. Additionally, this program is being recorded. It will be available for viewing. We'll send out the link to everyone who registered. So I will now turn it over to RZA's president, Stephen Flato.
Thanks, Alicia. Hello, everybody. Welcome to you and to our esteemed guest speaker, David Weinberg. David is a managing senior fellow of the Jerusalem-based Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. It's a leading defense think tank in Israel. David is also a fellow in the research department of Habithonistim, Israel's Defense and Security Forum, and the Israel Office Director of CIJA, Canada's Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. David is a veteran diplomatic and defense columnist for the Jerusalem Post. Those of us who get the Post can see his columns, especially on Friday for the weekend, as well as for Israel Hayom newspapers. His columns, if you're interested in going into his archive, are located at davidmweinberg.com. I recommend it to you. In the past, David has served as senior advisor to Deputy Israeli Prime Minister Natan Sharansky and was the founding coordinator of the Global Forum Against Anti-Semitism in the Israeli Prime Minister's office. David specializes in Israel-U.S. relations, Israel's defense posture and policy, the Iran-Israel confrontation, and the Abraham Accords. He traveled frequently to the UAE for dialogue with colleagues at Emirati think tanks. David studied Torah with three of the greatest Torah scholars of the previous generation. Hope this doesn't embarrass you, David. Rabbi Hayom Yashiyahu Adari at Yeshiva HaKotel, Rabbi Dr. Aharon Lichtenstein at Yeshiva Har Etzion, and Nechama Leibowitz at Lifshitz College. He's also an accredited expert on Israeli and kosher wines, who conducts wine education programs and food and wine tours across Israel. He studied oenology at the London-based International Wine and Spirit Education Trust, has a level 3 certification. Because of his widely published articles on Israeli wine, Al Jazeera accused Weinberg in 2022 of being, and I quote, drunk on Zion, and I quote again, wine washing the occupation. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Mr. Flato, and thank you all for joining this evening. Indeed, I am drunk on Zion, but we'll try to give you a sober assessment of where we're at and what to expect in U.S.'s relations under incoming President Trump. I'll relate to quite a few of the issues that are on the current agenda, including the hostage release deal that was just announced a few minutes ago. I'm going to relate to the proposed deal with Saudi Arabia and to the looming confrontation with Iran, and try to do all that in about 20 minutes. I want to start with a story. And the story goes back to this last summer. Last summer, almost all the senior Republican security and defense officials visited Israel. I'm talking about the people who served in the senior posts in the first Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, Robert O'Brien, Victoria Coates, and many others, Herbert McMaster. And I'm talking about quite a few of the people who are now being appointed to posts in the second Trump administration. And amazingly, what I and my colleagues at the Misgav Institute for National Security heard from all these individuals was the same thing. They all told us the exact same thing, and they taught me a new word, and the word is sequencing. We wanted to talk to them about confronting Iran. And their response was, yes, but you should know that Trump has his priorities, and inevitably, an administration which has a lot of issues on its agenda is going to apply sequencing. And the sequencing, or the priorities for Trump, they told us, are number one, immigration, number two, China, and number three, the economy. Everything else will be dealt with, but in proper sequencing, in good time. And Israel needs to know to bide its time, learn how to work with Trump and his senior officials, and eventually Israel will get around to obtaining the things that it wants. Now, let me spell this out. This is a dynamic that I think is playing out right now with regards to the just announced hostage deal. The Trump team understands Israel's need to pursue the campaign against Hamas, to crush Hamas. They know that they need to resupply Israel with weapons and perhaps back continuation of the campaign against Hamas down the road. But in the immediate term, what they want is quiet so that they can get to their sequencing, so they can get to their other priorities. And the show of resolve and Trump's own tough personality, which indeed was what seems to have brought about this emerging hostage deal. Trump's threat that all hell would break loose if there wasn't a deal in place by the time he took office. All that applied pressure to the parties in the region, and that includes Israel. Now, I'll come back to the emerging hostage deal a little bit later, but first, I want to dial back and zoom out to the broader context of U.S.-Israel relations as Trump takes the White House once again, and the way in which I believe that the Trump administration is going to be radically different, favorably so, than the Biden administration. And I want to relate to three subject areas. The first is delegitimization of Israel. The second is regional reconciliation, or U.S.-Saudi-Israeli relations. And the third is the all-important issue of Iran. So let's begin. Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and especially Vice President Kamala Harris essentially acted to delegitimize Israel and Israel's war with Hamas over the past year. Despite their support for Israel's war against Hamas and the significant weaponry and diplomatic support that the Biden administration gave to Israel, all formal and, as I say, substantial, nevertheless, a series of their actions and statements underlined or undermined Israel every step of the way. It begins with the demand that Israel truck into Gaza so-called humanitarian aid. Of course, it was much more than humanitarian aid, truckloads and truckloads of food, oil, gas, water, and electricity. It continues with the placing of brakes on the Israeli military campaign. And that's not just slow walking the supply of weaponry, but also warning Israel every step of the way, don't do this and don't do that. Don't invade Gaza. Don't take Shifa Hospital. Don't take Khan Yunis. Don't take Rafah. Don't take the Philadelphia corridor. Don't try to move civilian populations out of harm's way. Don't use large diameter bombs or other heavy ordnance. Don't. And the net result of these delays and restraints imposed by America is the grind in Gaza in which the IDF now finds itself, house by house slog through Hamas hideouts that's drawing blood from Israeli soldiers needlessly, in my view, almost every single day, without there being a decisive result. And this continues with a series of American statements throughout the last year about how it denied over and over again being involved with different parts of Israel's military campaign. So Washington was constantly reassuring the Europeans and indeed the Iranians that it was not involved in Israel's intensive campaign of strikes against Hezbollah, wasn't involved on the strike on Ibrahim Akil, that America wasn't involved in the strike on Hassan Nasrallah or Yahya Sinwar or Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. America was not involved in the beeper or pager bombings of Hezbollah leaders. Each time, the U.S. predictably prattled that it was not involved and it doesn't want to see an escalation, and that too undermined Israel. And then there's the statements most prominently made by Kamala Harris over and over again, which involves the use of what I view as a terrible word, and that the word is but. She allowed that Israel could defend itself, but how it does so matters. Israel has the right to defend itself, said Kamala Harris, but too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. And then she went on to say that Israel has the right to defend itself, but only if this leads rapidly to a two-state solution where the Palestinians can have security, dignity, and that they so rightly deserved, and so on. Now, since no one in Washington has a recipe for defeating an enemy that hides behind and beneath civilians without causing significant collateral damage, and no one in this region any longer believes that swift establishment of a full-fledged Palestinian state would truly bring stability or peace, Kamala Harris's but and her only lingo effectively neutered the IDF and weakened Israel. And in all these areas and more, one hopes and assumes that Marco Rubio, Mike Huckabee, Mike Waltz, and others will adopt a different tone. There's also an expectation here in Israel that the Trump administration will move rapidly to end some of the gratuitous and nasty Biden administration actions, such as the sanctions that were slapped on so-called violent settlers and other civil society Israeli organizations that the Biden administration did not like, such as Tzav Tesha, which was a group of Israelis that was opposed to the shipping in of humanitarian aid to Gaza, that the Trump administration will push back against the ICC and the ICJ and stop commenting every 5 minutes that another settlement expansion is announced. In all these areas, there is an expectation that the tone of the incoming administration will change, even if the Trump administration is not greenlighting further Israeli military operations in Gaza at the moment. That brings me to the second cluster I wanted to talk about, which is regional reconciliation, what's known as what is expected to be a deal with Saudi Arabia. This is the year that a tripartite U.S., Israel, Saudi accord will be reached, in my estimation. It's one of Trump's top priorities, and it's well within reach. Now, Israel will have to swallow some bitter pills to facilitate this, like acquiescence to the U.S. sale of F-35 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia, something that the Saudis are insisting on. By the way, that was part of the U.S. agreement with the Emirates, United Arab Emirates, when they signed the Abraham Accords with Israel, a sale that never went through because the Biden administration put restrictions on the use of those planes. The Emirati said, no, thank you. The Saudis are not going to be snookered. They expect the sale of F-35s, and Israel will have to acquiesce in that. Furthermore, Israel will have to accept a U.S.-backed Saudi civil nuclear program. It's not something that Israel's happy about, but Israel will have to play along with that. Netanyahu may even have to mutter something about a pathway, that's the code word, a pathway to Palestinian independence in the distant future, even though neither he nor the Saudis believe that this is feasible or sensible. Now, for Trump, everything is transactional, and he will expect Israel to play ball regarding a Saudi deal along these lines. If Israel does so, I think it'll be well placed to expect a return from Trump down the line on issues closer to home, ranging from Israeli assertion of sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria, to push back against the nasty international organizations that I mentioned that are on Israel's throats, that I mentioned earlier, to the Iranian issue. And that brings me to Iran. I cannot believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu will forego the historic opportunity before us to complete his 25-year-long campaign against Iranian domination without a game-changing, crushing blow in Iran, a piece de resistance, something which might also blessedly lead to regime change in that country. In short, there is at hand an opportunity to reset the regional strategic architecture beyond the knockback already delivered to Iran and its so-called Shiite arc or circle of fire against Israel. Iran's proxies have been largely eviscerated. Tehran has been stripped by Israel of its air defenses, and therefore there must be a next stage in the campaign against Iran. Now, in the short term, I think that Trump is going to do all the things Israel wants to see. He's going to hit the Iranians with maximum sanctions, as he did in his first term. He may even assassinate one or two more IRGC leaders, just as he bumped off Qasem Soleimani in order to show who's boss. But then Trump is likely to sue for a grand deal with Iran, in many ways no less so than Obama and Biden sought a grand deal with Iran. After all, Trump views himself as the grand deal maker, as the ultimate global businessman who knows how to cut deals. I don't believe that such a deal with the Iranians will be at hand. And my expectation is that when Trump realizes that, we'll move to plan B, which is to crush the Iranians. If you recall, Trump thought he was going to get a grand nuclear deal with North Korea, never materialized. Trump thought he was going to bring peace to the Israeli-Palestinian quadrant through his what was known as his 100-year plan, or deal of the century, as he called it, and that never materialized either. But I think we can expect Trump to go in that direction, at least in the first stage. There's also a secondary issue, which is how to deal with Turkish leader Erdogan, or should I say the Turkish dictator Erdogan. He's going to demand significant attention over the coming year, meaning that somebody's going to have to counter his Ottoman-style hegemonic ambitions and ruthless inclinations. Erdogan has already occupied a swath of northern Syria. He seeks to dominate the entire country through the new Syrian rebel leader al-Jawlani and to threaten Israel from there. And he is preparing to carry out genuine genocide against the Kurds in western Turkey and northern Syria. Real genocide, not the type of genocide, fake genocide that he accuses Israel of, but real genocide, unless Erdogan is stopped by Trump. if I roll this all together and come back to our current moment, the hostage deal, I think we have to look at this in terms of what it tells us about President Trump's proclivities and style of operation. Now, I'll just tell you as an aside that I'm not sure that the hostage deal will actually be implemented. Hamas will raise 1,000 objections and new stipulations every hour over the coming days. It still has to pass the Israeli cabinet. I think it will tomorrow, but it's going to rock the coalition. And I'm not happy with the contours of the deal as published. I'm not happy with the terrorists released. I'm not happy with IDF redeployment out of much of Gaza, or the allowing of Palestinian residents back to northern Gaza, or the truckloads of supplies and aid that Israel is supposedly going to facilitate every day. I'm uncomfortable with the contours of the deal, but it nevertheless may go through for a number of reasons, and we need to know what they are. Number one, because the Israeli public has been demanding it. And the pressure from the Israeli public and the overwhelmingly left-leaning dominant Israeli media has been overwhelming. Second of all, there's been Trump's pressure, and Trump's pressure apparently was significant. Third of all, and this is uncomfortable to talk about, there is the mistrust, the deep mistrust that has developed between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli military leadership, mistrust of IDF leaders. There is a feeling in Netanyahu circles that Israel has gone as far as it can in the campaign against Hamas with the current military leadership. It's time to take a breather, replace the 10 top generals in the Israeli army and rebuild the Israeli army, hopefully with significant American military resupply of weaponry and armaments, before a next stage in the inevitable next stage in campaign against Hamas in Gaza goes forward. And then finally, there's the issue of Iran. Iran. If there is a U.S.-Israel understanding about a next level military campaign against Iran relatively soon, then in my view, the current ceasefire and the hostage deal can be justified, at least for as long as it takes for the strike on Iran to take place. And that's where we are at the moment. Now, all this, in my view, creates enormous challenges, what we might call Hasbara challenges, for Israel and for diaspora Jewry. We've been talking for 25, 30 years, ever since the Oslo Accords, about Israel's outstretched hand for peace and its willingness to compromise with the Palestinians over territory and so much more. And now we need a new discourse, a discourse that begins with recapturing a sense of outrage about anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish sentiment. It's simply not enough to explain Israel's security dilemmas or revisit Israel's outstretched hand for peace, its diplomatic generosity over the last 3 years. What's needed is a much more basic restatement of Israel's cause and its purpose. Israel is a grand historic reunion of people and land. Israel as a reliable anchor for democracy in a dangerous part of the world. I think that when you talk about justice in the Jewish nation, we win. And we need to start owning up to Israel's overwhelming military power and the usefulness of its acting to reset the regional strategic architecture in a way that will not only reinforce Israeli deterrence and security, but will reinforce global security. I think there's no choice but to own up to Israel's strength. We have to affirm it. We have to articulate it. We have to explain how that strength is justifiably and wisely being used to fight Iran, Islamic jihadism, and annihilationist against Israel, Palestinianism. It's better to lead with shock and awe than shrink and whimper. And all that is a change of discourse that not everybody's going to be comfortable with, but we're going to need, I believe, to adopt in order both to advance Israel's agenda and to put U.S.-Israel relations on a better footing. I'll stop there and be glad to entertain your thoughts, comments, and questions.
Thank you very, very much, David. In my neighborhood in Jerusalem, one of my fellow shul members, a man in his late 50s, basically forced his way back into the IDF in his old brigade. And he's located in the West Bank. He's located in the Shomron. And he reported to me about a month or so ago something that I think was going on all along, and that is there's a quiet war going on in the West Bank, in Yehuda and in the Shomron, where the IDF and the border police are dealing with terrorism every day, whether it's Molotov cocktails, whether it's rifle shots, whether they're trying to burn cars or throw rocks at buses as they drive up Route 60. There's actually a war going on. At the same time, all of a sudden, the Palestinian Authority, who has ignored the requirements imposed on them more than 30 years ago under the so-called Oslo Accords, they were supposed to disarm terror groups, and which they never, ever did. But now they seem to be taking, unless I'm totally misreading what I'm reading in the newspapers, they seem to be taking on Hamas and Islamic Jihad and some of these so-called lone wolves. Am I seeing them actually doing this, or is it somebody puffing up their reactions? Are they trying to show us that now we're worthy of a state, we're worthy of going into Gaza and running the enclave again? Or is it all just an illusion?
So you're correct, Mr. Flatel. Reading the international press and reading much of the overwhelmingly left-wing Israeli press, you inevitably would get the impression that the threats to stability in Judea and Samaria come from so-called settler violence and settler housing starts. You wouldn't know much, you couldn't know much about the real sources of instability, which are escalating Palestinian terrorism, surging illegal Palestinian construction in zones of strategic importance to Israel, wildly out of control arson attacks, and massive smuggling of weaponry, Iranian weaponry, mainly from Jordan into northern Samaria. Attacks on Palestinian property and individuals by a few extremists at the fringes of 500,000 Israelis, overwhelmingly peaceful Israelis who live over the Green Line, is negligible. It calculates the level of violence that's lower than the level of violence of Israelis against Israelis that afflicts Greater Tel Aviv. I don't mean to diminish the ugliness of so-called settler attacks, but Nablus and Jenin and Tulkarem and Kalkilia have become dens of hardcore Iranian-supplied terrorist groups, requiring nightly interdiction raids by IDF commandos with heavy engineering and airstrike support. The Army has moved to using drones and Air Force strikes in northern Samaria. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Israel's been forced to eliminate well over 500 terrorists in Yehuda v'Shomron over the past year. And I know there's well over 5,000 or 6,000 arrests of terrorists or those suspected of terrorism. So there is a real war underway. And as I mentioned, there's also the illegal land grabs, the arson attacks, which are burning well over 1,000 fires in Judea and Samaria, many of them adjacent to Jewish towns and Israeli army bases, almost all of them certainly caused by Palestinian arson. By the way, some of them are caused by arson, by fires lit by radical Israeli left-wing activists. It's not just Palestinians, unfortunately. The problem is that the reality of Palestinian terrorist violence and belligerence doesn't stand a chance of grabbing anybody's attention in Tel Aviv, Washington, or Brussels when the Israeli army is fighting in Gaza, striking in Syria, or dealing terrorists for hostages.
Now, I don't think you mentioned the magic word Jordan. Where do the Jordanians fit into this picture? I know that he's been a favorite at the White House. King Abdullah II has been there several times. We get this hot and cold reaction from him, bitterly criticizing an Israeli tourist on Har HaBayit. At the same time, I get the impression that it's Israel and the United States that's keeping him alive and in power. Where does the Kingdom of Jordan fit in with Saudi Arabia and with Israel?
I'm a fierce critic of King Abdullah of Jordan. Years ago, in better days, I met him in Amman twice, and he offered the most pro-Israel, anti-Iranian, anti-Obama discourse you could possibly imagine. But in recent years, Abdullah has become a bad actor. He baselessly claims exclusive custodianship over the Temple Mount. He fiercely opposed the Trump plan for regional peace because it specified freedom of worship on Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, and also because the administration insinuated a role for Saudi Arabia in administrating the Al-Aqsa Mosque, perhaps alongside Jordan. And nothing more upsets the Hashemites than the suggestion that they might lose out to the Saudis in safeguarding Al-Aqsa. But he's a problem. And the border between Israel and Jordan, Israel's longest border, has become porous. Unfortunately, Abdullah has also been willing to employ historical falsifications, radical rhetoric to undermine Israeli rights in Jerusalem and in general. He is no longer a clean or trustworthy partner for Israel, although he does play one important role, which is to keep Jordan out of radical Islamic hands. Were Jordan to fall to rebels such as al-Jolani in Syria, or some of the Iranian-backed Iraqi Shiite militias, or anybody else armed and supplied by the IRGC, Israel's security predicament would be far, far worse than we can imagine. And therefore, Abdullah, as you suggested, always seems to benefit from some sort of, cotton ball protective treatment, what they call in Hebrew, utrag, milashon etrog. Etrog is always wrapped and very carefully in fine wrapping and handled very carefully. So Abdullah too, and the Kingdom of Jordan is always seems to be somewhat sacrosanct, even though he's not a good partner. And I expect that if there's movement towards a U.S.-Israel-Saudi deal, as we discussed earlier, he will act up further.
Maybe you don't want to, talk about this, but it's been bothering me as with my American background, is sometimes I'm embarrassed by the way Israeli generals carry on in the press. And the things that they say and the positions that at least come out publicly seem to be indicative of a military that does not really believe that it's under the control of the elected officials in Israel. Am I misreading that?
There are generals, and there are generals. And there are colonels and lieutenant colonels of different stripes. You're correct in pointing to the fact that there is a unelected level of officials in Israel, whether they be justice ministry officials and court officials, judges, and the generals, who have an ecosystem which is pretty closed and self-reinforcing. Mostly what we would be forced to call leftists. And that's been true ever since the advent of the Oslo Accords. And the net result of that, of course, was October 7th. Groupthink that could not imagine fighting a real war in Gaza again, and that had not prepared the military for that, and was blind to the signals that Hamas was moving in a different direction. So yes, there is a problem, which is why I spoke about earlier about the mistrust between Netanyahu and the military leadership. As brave as many Israeli generals and colonels have been in prosecuting the war of the last year and a half, they also have been a drag on the desires of the political echelon to carry the campaign deeper and further. The other drag, as we discussed, of course, was Washington. So there is a problem. It's a generational thing. I sincerely hope, I believe, that we're in for a generational change in Israeli leadership. That's true of Netanyahu as well. In the elections of, let's say, 2028, 3 years forward, I hope and believe that a new generation of Israelis will enter the political sphere. Many of them being the lieutenant colonels and colonels, the brigade and division commanders of this war, who have shown tremendous belief, religious belief, nationalist sentiment, and great heroism, and will give Israel a new, even more inspired leadership than we have at the moment, both in the military and on the political level. That is my hope and belief.
I'm noticing in the casualty list that unfortunately come out, am I incorrectly seeing that a tremendous amount of the casualties are actually from the Dati community?
Excuse me while I
That's fine. You're the analogist.
wet my palate. Unfortunately, you're correct. As a kippah sruga wearing Israeli myself, as a ardent religious Zionist, it's piercingly painful to see that I think a majority, well over 50% of the soldiers killed and wounded in this war are from the Dati Leumi religious Zionist sector. You see it in their names. You see it in the cities they come from and the schools they went to. And it is everybody in the Dati Leumi world in Israel knows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more people killed or injured, or neighbors who have lost sons or lost sons, limbs of sons in this war. That's true of my own family and neighborhood orbit as well. And among other, what that done has sharpened the anger, not just in broad Israeli society, but in religious Zionist society towards the Haredi community for its continuing refusal to bear the burden of military or alternative national service. We had reason to believe, or many people wanted to believe, that the trauma and suffering of the past 15 months, especially in the Torah, the religious Zionist Torah community, would shock the ultra-Orthodox community out of its crushingly insular shell and nudge it forward towards national service. But Nada. Nothing. It hasn't happened to any significant degree, nor, in my view, will it. Haredi elders, who, as you know, inevitably are 90-year-old plus scholars, locked into an ideological framework that posits the spiritual primacy of their Torah learning above all else. They're not capable of adjusting to the realities and necessities of Jewish statehood. And I really don't see, unfortunately, any solution to this painful issue, no matter what draft law or draft exemption law is passed by this government or a future government, no matter what sanctions are imposed on Haredi families and institutions. This is a grand historic tragedy that has the potential to crash Israel in the heavens and the earth, no less. Now, I don't dismiss the whole range of impressive efforts that are underway to integrate older Haredi men and women in soft military and civilian security frameworks, like the military industries and regional defense brigades, but that only nibbles at the edges of the need. And the need is large-scale draft of to the fighting army of 18 to 26-year-old Haredi men, and it's not happening.
That's an issue that very difficult for me personally to wrap my my head around. I learned with a Haredi Chavrusa here in the United States, so we try to stay away from that subject matter. But I want to get back to the Palestinian Authority, if I may. I've had them on my mind, not only for what happened many years ago, but what seems to be going on again today. Coming back to the after Gaza, after the war is over, is the PA going to have any role, do you think, in running Gaza again?
So before I answer your question about the PA, let me say one more thing about the Haredi draft or non-draft issue that we just discussed.
Please.
It's deeply personal for many in Israel, especially, as I said, for people in the so-called religious Zionist Torah world, like myself. I have 3 ultra-Orthodox brother-in-laws and some 30-plus Haredi nephews, none of whom have the equivalent of a high school education or will ever serve in the Israeli army as far as they're concerned. Whereas my 3 boys and 2 son-in-laws have all spent a collective more than 500 days on the Gaza, Lebanon, and Yudav Shomron fronts over the last year. And it's become so bitter that I can't get my boys to go to most family smachot, family celebratory events on the Haredi side of the family these days. It's just too bitter. We love our Haredi cousins, but we don't have patience for them right now.
Palestinian Authority, Gaza.
This is here's another example of an internationally accepted discourse that doesn't seem to have changed much, despite October 7th. One would think that the international community would realize that the pre-October 7th conceptions of the importance of a drive towards a full-fledged Palestinian state and what's known as a 2-state solution would be put to the wayside. In Israeli minds, it certainly has. To talk about Palestinian statehood now, let's say we were to go to an election campaign tomorrow. Any Israeli leader who talks about the need to move rapidly towards Palestinian statehood will be dead in the water. You won't hear that from Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid or anybody else who might run on the center-left in the next Israeli elections. They know it would be the kiss of death. And yet on the international playing field, what's known as the EKP seems to stand firm. EKP meaning the everybody knows paradigm. The everybody knows paradigm is that the only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the holy two-state solution. Not only that, there are countries in the world that have doubled down on the two-state solution since October 7th. Many European countries unilaterally recognizing Palestinian statehood. And by the way, I'm absolutely convinced that that's where Washington would have gone had Kamala Harris been elected president of the United States. Justin Trudeau of Canada was moving in that direction. The Australian government has effectively already moved in that direction. Britain might have moved in that direction. There are countries like Spain and France and others who've already moved there. Who knows where Germany would have ended up? Despite October 7th, people are doubling down on the two-state solution instead of understanding that it's time to think of different alternative creative solutions, and that remains a problem. It's a diplomatic defeat for Israel, something that Israel has not managed to deal with.
We have in America the ability for grassroots, what's the right word, not campaigning, but getting our voices heard. If we wanted to express our concerns about a potential civil nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia, where should we address that to?
Well, it's an issue that I'm sure will go before Congress. The Saudis are insisting on a full-fledged, mutual defense treaty with the United States as part of whatever broader regional constellation that emerges, also including Israel. It's not going to be something that can be slipped in under the carpet or signed just on the White House lawn. This is going to be treaty level. That's going to need to go to the Senate, and there need to be good questions asked about the sensibility of this and the safeguards that have to be in place before Washington either sanctions or even cooperates in a Saudi civilian nuclear program.
It's funny, here in America, the federal government and the states have been shutting down nuclear plants for power purposes, for electricity, because they want to go solar, they want to go green, they want to do whatever you want to call it. Yet they're willing to allow a foreign country to basically claim they're going to be providing just electricity and research with their nuclear plants. I mean, does Saudi Arabia need nuclear power to run its electricity in the country? I mean, I don't understand that part of it.
It's a good question. I don't have a truly well-informed enough answer, so I'm not going to fake one. The counter argument is that if you don't cooperate with the Saudis on this, because they insist on it, the Saudis will go elsewhere, to the Chinese or the Pakistanis, and buy their nuclear power from them with no safeguards. So better to do it this way. That's an argument that I've already heard, and I'm sure you'll hear more of it.
And I guess Israel would be reluctant to bomb a nuclear power plant that was paid for or built by the United States. We've been ending our conversation since October 7th with the phrase Besorah Tovot. And I think everybody on the call, it means so much to hear good news. And we should only hear Besorah Tovot sooner than later. Hostages should be released, but unfortunately not at any price. I can get flack for saying that, but there are certain prices you can't afford to pay. If we look at our history of what we've done, what Israel has done in the past with prisoner releases and where those people wound up very quickly thereafter, And we just have to keep praying that saner heads are behind everything. And they're giving deep thought to everything that is going on right now. I wish I could believe that's true, but I'm not too sure. Having said, do you disagree? How are you gonna?
If I may,
Please,
I have a retort
please.
to offer. I'm sick and tired
Uh-oh.
of hearing the phrase "Besorot Tovot," or as my Haredi brother-in-laws and cousins and nephews say, "B'suros Tovos." That's not good enough. I don't object to B'suros Tovos, but I add to that nitzchonot v'nekamot, victories and revenge. I think we have a right to demand of our leaders and of the heavens, nitzchonot v'nekamot, victories and vengeance. I do in my davening, in my prayers, 3 times a day. The people of Israel have sacrificed so much over the last 15 months, shown such great heroism and resilience that we have a right to demand of the heavens more than Besorot Tovot, more than good tidings. We need victories, overwhelmingly crushing victories, and appropriate revenge. And I expect God to kick in.
Okay. Expecting, we all do. We all do. David, thank you very, very much. If I may, for 1 second, let our viewers know that 2 important things are happening this spring. First of all, on Sunday, January 19th, Rav Doron Perez, Executive Chairman of Mizrachi World Movement, will be presenting a program called Israel Under Fire, How Should We Respond? It'll be done by Zoom. We'll be getting out the link. Again, it's in the chat right now, if you'd like to check that out. And March 10th opens up the election season for the, I'll call it Israel's future, in the World Zionist Congress. The season begins March 10th, ends on May 4th, and participation of the American Orthodox community in this election is essential. And I can't urge you strongly enough to cast a vote for the Mizrachi slate that will be presented during the election. And I will close by once again saying that we continue to pray for the release of the hostages and their safe return home to Israel, and victories and vengeance as well. I have to start adding to that. So Alicia, if there's anything else you want to add, please do so now, and then if not, I think we can end the program.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As I said, you will receive the link. And if you have any further questions or comments, we look forward to being in touch with you and continuing to advance religious Zionism both here in America and our connection to Israel. Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.